Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this early session of Transforming Library Spaces to Support Modern Day Users, stories from academic libraries undertaking deselection and shared print projects. I'm Matt Barnes. I'm the Director of Sustainable Collection Services, and I lead the product team that's responsible for developing and implementing Greenglass. The stars of our program this morning are Rick Davis from Towson University and Missy Latham from Loyola Notre Dame. But before handing it over to them, I thought it would be useful to provide a background on sustainable collection services and Greenglass, particularly for those of you who may not be familiar with us, as those both play a role in the subsequent presentations. We will also be taking questions at the end of the presentation on SES, Greenglass, and of course on Rick and Missy's presentations. The inspiration for sustainable collection services occurred about 10 years ago. Two of the founders of Sustainable Collection Services, SES for short, Rick Lugg and Ruth Fisher, at the time were operating R2 Consulting. I was a workflow consultant with R2 as well for about 3 years during that same time frame. And what we found then in library after library was a mighty struggle, if you will, against the ever-growing collection of monographs and the lack of growth in space to store those monographs. For some libraries, this came down to having shelving that was literally bursting at the seams with books. We saw situations where libraries were unable to shelve new acquisitions. And the crux of the problem was that the data necessary to make the decisions on what should happen to books, what books should be potentially deselected, what books should be moved out of the main stacks and then put on a truck down the interstate to the storage bunker, that data to make those decisions in a safe and informed manner was scattered. It was in all different places, it was often dirty at that time, and it was very difficult to bring it together in a way that folks could make decisions confidently about what should happen to the monographs in their collections when they had space problems. And so in 2011, Rick and Ruth, and then two other founders who are with us today, Eric Redmond, our engineer, and Andy Breeding, our product manager, founded Sustainable Collection Services to solve exactly that problem. Now, at first, the focus was really on data-driven deselection, solving that issue that we saw in the libraries at that time. And then 2 years later, when the initial version of the Greenglass decision support system was launched, the focus was again primarily on data-driven deselection in the application. However, even at that time, it was becoming abundantly clear that groups of libraries were looking to come together, and before taking on any kind of deselection or right sizing or major moves of their collections, these groups wanted to build shared print programs that would allow libraries to assign retention commitments to individual members and essentially secure the scholarly record and provide what we like to call a retention safety net, which then would enable very safe deselection where everything has been maintained locally. SES began looking into this at that point. However, at the same time, OCLC was producing a lot of research in this area. Not a lot of people may know this, but OCLC was also an early investor in Sustainable Collection Services and also a data partner for Sustainable Collection Services. So in 2015, it made a lot of sense for SES to join OCLC through an acquisition. This was really a boon for SES. It provided increased access, so much faster access to WorldCat data. It provided access to certain data elements that we didn't have before. An example is the work ID in WorldCat. This work ID is what allows Greenglass and SES to distinguish between certain editions of a title in Greenglass, which of course can be very important in retention and deselection scenarios. And then perhaps most significantly, after SES joined OCLC, there was the funding and resources available for a major expansion of Greenglass, and you'll hear a little bit about this in the later presentations. to add group functionality. And this was functionality in Greenglass that specifically supported those groups of libraries that wanted to come together and build shared print programs. And so now Greenglass was really about shared print retention programs as well as optionally deselection, providing both of those. And we continue to see the synergy of this come together. We just before ALA, the monograph shared print registration service in WorldCap for single part monographs was brought live. And if anybody has any questions about that, Nick Valentini, the product manager, is here with us this morning. So we're very pleased to see that come together as well, creating a package of shared print services at OCLC. So that early observation that took place, over 10 years ago, that the libraries needed some help. Well, it proved true. At this point, SES has worked with over 300 libraries in both individual and group projects. So I've mentioned Greenglass several times over the last few minutes, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I just wanted to specifically define what it is and what it does. Greenglass is a web-based application that enables libraries to model scenarios and create lists of titles for retention and or informed deselection of print monographs. This is essentially what pulls all of that data that I'd mentioned was in disparate sources and oftentimes was dirty together into one place so that confident decisions can be made. This works by receiving an extract of local data from you. SES takes the item level data from your catalog. We clean that data and we normalize it, and we then match that data to other sources, most notably WorldCap, so that for every title in your project or collection, you'll know how many other libraries in your region or in the country also hold that title. We can distinguish if that title is the exact same edition or any edition of that title. And then we also match this up to various comparator groups or groups that are important to you. So how many people in your ILL group, for instance, have that title? How many people in your consortia have that? How many libraries in your consortia have that title as well? And that allows you to make decisions based on what other folks contain in their collections. We also match the data to other sources such as Haughty Trust. Has that title in your collection been digitized by Haughty? If so, is it in copyright or out of copyright? And then there's Choice. Has it been reviewed by Choice? And if so, is it an outstanding academic title? And so forth. And so this is essentially what gives everyone the context to finally make those decisions about their monographs collection. The final thing I'll say about Greenglass is we very specifically made this quite visual. There's one screenshot up here of a visualization that looks at the years published and with an overlay of usage of the titles by years published. This, for some folks who have used Greenglass, this is the first time they've actually been able to see their collection in exactly the way that Greenglass puts it together. It's very useful for developing the strategies for pursuing shared print, retention, and deselection projects. And then I'd say equally important, it's very useful for communicating the decisions that the library is making to both internal stakeholders as well as external stakeholders. We've had people actually take screenshots of the visualizations in Greenglass, put them into presentations for discussions with faculty who may, for instance, have concerns about a deselection project in a library or items being moved to a high-density facility down the road. And so that was very much on purpose so that it could be used as a tool to not just make decisions but communicate those. We continue to enhance Greenglass. Just in the last 12 months, we've had over a half dozen enhancements to the system, and we're continuing. We have another full slate of enhancements on schedule for the next 12 months. It's easy as somebody who owns the product within OCLC to make the case that there should be continued development here. We've begun tracking the print monograph retention commitments that we know about in North America. By our count, and there may be others out there, there's about 40 million retention commitments at this point across about 13 groups. Right now, about 16 and a half of those were from Haughty Trust's first phase for their shared print program. About 400,000 were from FLAIR, but 23 million of those are from programs that used Greenglass and sustainable collection services to actually identify the retention commitments. Notably in here is East, which had roughly 9 million retention commitments alone, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in the upcoming presentations. And so there has been, I think, a significant impact that came from, again, that observation a little over 10 years ago that this is an area where the community needs some help. And so what's next? What are we going to do going forward? One of the things we'd like to do is within the next 12 months is we're looking at how our group projects work. Right now we have a cohort, a batch-based system, and so if an individual library wanted to, for instance, join East, today they'd have to wait for the East Cohort 3 to come together as a big group to move forward. Our vision for this is we want an individual library to be able to come to an agreement with East and then simply plug in on demand and be able to participate. And so that's something that we have funded and are working on. We will continue to enhance the functionality of Greenglass to make it increasingly powerful. One of the principles that we're pursuing, and we think that we've achieved to a great extent, is trying to make it make it intuitive. Somebody who has a data wrangling skill level of 0 could use Greenglass to run some very sophisticated and powerful scenarios. It's simple point and click. And so we're going to continue to add data elements that allow anybody to use this software to run some very interesting and very powerful scenarios for their programs. And then finally, we're building a web application that will begin tracking. I'd mentioned we're tracking retention commitments across North America. We're putting together a web application that will be publicly available that will show the number of retention commitments by program in their members, assuming we receive permission to do so. And so I hope that overview was helpful. I think now let's get the real part of this show started. Rick.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd also like to thank Rick Lugg, Matt, Aaron Duncan, and the rest of the SES team for inviting me to participate in this session. My job title, as you see on the slide, is Copyright and Scholarly Communications Librarian, but I work within the Content Management Department of my library. Not too long ago, this was called Technical Services, and it still includes our acquisitions and cataloging staff. I was initially hired, though, as a cataloging librarian, and I'm still responsible for overseeing our local cataloging work. Until last year, I also served as the primary liaison librarian to our English department, and in that role, I coordinated the expenditure of the English department's annual acquisitions allocation, which also happens to be the largest departmental allocation in our library. So I came to the whole enterprise of library deselection with the perspectives of a cataloger, a sometime instructional librarian, and a subject selector with over 14 years personal investment in a sizable share of our print collection. So before I discuss my library's experience with SCS and Greenglass, I'd like to briefly describe my library, my university, and consortium. My library is the Albert S. Cook Library of Towson University, shown here on the slide. It's located about 8 miles due north of downtown Baltimore. Our current building opened in 1968, so it reached its half centennial this year. We're not likely to see a new building in the foreseeable future since my university has several other major capital improvement projects underway, including a huge science complex which is slated to open in fall 2020. And then there are other high priority construction projects planned to begin before anyone draws up any thoughts or plans for a new library building. Our building has over 180,000 square feet spread across 5 floors, with the circulating collections shelved in open stacks on the 2nd, 4th, and 5th floors. We have about 400,000 volumes in our print collection overall, both circulating and non-circulating. Our library has about 50 employees, half of whom are librarians. Most of the librarians serve as liaisons to one or more academic departments on campus. Our current Dean of Libraries, Deborah Nolan, began her tenure at Cook Library in 2006, and almost from the beginning she's been very actively engaged in updating, expanding, and repurposing our library spaces to better meet the needs of today's students and faculty, again dealing with the reality of there's no new building on the horizon, so work with what you have. My institution, Towson University, had a total enrollment last fall of 22,705 part-time and full-time students, or a full-time equivalency of just over 19,000. This slide shows just one corner of the campus, but I chose it because it includes the library, which was actually built as an annex to the much smaller building that the library formerly occupied. And if I can figure out how to do this. Oops, no, don't want to do that. Okay, well, I'll use my fingers. I'll do it the old-fashioned way. So this is our current library building right here, and this is the original building that we were in. So you can see that the original building at the top of the photo and our current building, the current building is about 4 times the size of the original building, and we only occupied a portion of that old building in the first place. So beginning in 1968, we had a lot of empty space to grow into. And then the last thing to say about my institution here is that we're classified under the Master's Colleges and Universities Larger Programs category. While most of our students are undergraduates, we do have several master's degree programs and 5 applied doctoral programs. Our consortium, the University System of Maryland and Affiliated Institutions, or USMAI, currently has 17 member libraries, including 16 libraries serving Maryland's public universities and colleges, and 1 library, our newest consortium member and the home base of my co-presenter, Missy, which serves 2 private universities. The types of libraries within our consortium vary widely. Most are general academic libraries serving institutions of different sizes throughout the state, including small, mid-sized, and large master's colleges and universities, and a few doctoral universities. We also have a few specialized libraries in our consortium, including 2 law libraries, 1 health sciences and human services library, and 1 environmental sciences library. The consortium was originally established by just 4 institutions in the early 1980s to implement a shared ILS. The consortium continued to add members over the years, migrating to a second and then a third shared ILS, and that's our current system, which is Aleph from Ex Libris. A team of system librarians based at the University of Maryland College Park campus maintains Aleph and other shared systems on behalf of the consortium. This team is called Consortial Library Application Support, or CLASS, which is how I'll be referring to it in the rest of my remarks. One of the consortium's earliest initiatives, besides implementing a shared ILS, was to coordinate resource sharing via patron-placed holds, which at the time was a somewhat innovative service. But aside from this, and until the last few years, the consortium didn't really engage in any kind of systematic shared collections-related activities, aside from the licensing of a limited number of centrally funded online databases. So the USMAI Consortium's use of SCS, beginning in January of last year, really represented a new phase of coordinated collections-related activity for us. Returning for a moment to my own library, this slide outlines the major phases of our local collection management efforts. As I said before, when the building opened in 1968, it was a great leap forward in terms of space for us. So the emphasis those first few decades was really on filling the empty shelves. To assist with this, we had a fairly lax gifts policy, where a majority of materials donated to us were added to the collection, even in many cases when these were duplicates of items already on our shelves. During this time, weeding and updating of the collection was done in piecemeal fashion by the subject librarians, as time allowed and without any real coordinated guidance. By 2000, the collection was beginning to show its age. We filled that space, but it was beginning to look, some of the collection was beginning to look old. We brought in some external consultants to review the collection in 2005, and they simply confirmed that the collection needed to be weeded and updated in a more systematic fashion than we've been doing up until that point. But we were about to embark on a dramatic expansion and redesign of our special collection space on the 5th floor at that time, so that project took precedence. Meanwhile, our new dean was completing her doctorate and heavily using certain parts of our collection herself, allowing her to see firsthand how difficult it was to use the collection effectively. She began to think of the needed improvements less as weeding, with all the negative connotations that implies, and more as collection enhancement. By removing the outdated, obsolete, duplicate, and unused items, we could make the collection not only more visually appealing to our patrons, but also easier to use. Less could be more if we can only separate the bibliographic chaff from the wheat and do it in an informed, data-driven manner. We were already embarked on a comprehensive review of our journal collection at this time, changing many of our print subscriptions to electronic only, and withdrawing several bound journals, which we had perpetual access to via JSTOR. Weeding from our circulating monographs in addition to this could allow us to dramatically reduce the footprint of our collection. We did a coordinated first pass through the monograph collection, removing the easy stuff, things like duplicate copies and damaged, outdated books that weren't worth replacing or even repairing. Our dean then met with facility planners from the university to outline the types of new spaces and services that we wanted to provide to our users. The planners ultimately reported that we need to reduce the footprint of our print collection by an additional 45,000 volumes to accomplish all that she outlined. So that was our goal over the next 2 years, from 2016 to 2018, a dramatic reduction of 45,000 volumes, which was about 10% of our existing print collection, but it was really the tight time frame that we had to do that in that made it an ambitious goal for us. By this time, we had removed about 15,000 volumes between the bound journal withdrawals and the first pass of our monographs collection. To do any further deselection, we knew that we'd need reliable and easy to access data on what remained on our shelves. Our dean had attended a few presentations like this one on SES, and she had spoken with a few other library directors, including, I believe, the director of Missy's library, who had used SES and who were pleased with the results. Meanwhile, our consortium's governing body, the Council of Library Directors, and the USMAI Executive Director have begun to discuss using SCS as part of an effort to expand our consortium's collaboration in collection management, perhaps even to set up a shared print retention program. But this was still in the early stages, and we had a pressing need at Towson to move forward, so we contracted with SCS on our own. Our director also felt that our use of SCS might serve as a good test case for the consortium to consider in its own deliberations, along with Missy's Library's use of SCS. So in mid-February 2016, our implementation team completed the SCS intake questionnaire. Our team at Towson consisted of 6 people, including our dean, 3 of our assistant university librarians, our metadata librarian, and me wearing my cataloging librarian hat. Our project goal was to identify a minimum of 30,000 additional volumes to withdraw from our collection over the next 2 years. We also outlined the scope of the analysis that we wanted SCS to perform, stipulating that our circulating monograph should be included and various other materials excluded. The excluded materials included our reference titles, our print GovDocs, our juvenile collections, scores, AV materials, special collections, faculty and alumni publications, ebooks, and our theses and dissertations. We also said that we wanted to define comparator groups of libraries to compare our WorldCat holdings to. Finally, we said that we needed to have our data available in Greenglass by May so that our librarians could start to use it in their collection enhancement work as soon as the spring semester ended. A couple of weeks later, in early March, SCS sent a complete project proposal based on the info that we provided on our intake questionnaire. And through March 2016, our local team coordinated with the class system librarians to complete the catalog and data questionnaire. This provided information about our circulation data, which in our case went back to 2003 in our current system. It also provided SCS with the catalog and other ILS info they would need to identify our in-scope collection codes and to create functional links from Greenglass to our OPAC. We submitted the second questionnaire in early April. And for our comparator libraries, we chose first the other libraries in our consortium, then other academic libraries in Maryland that aren't in our consortium. Class then extracted our catalog and circulation data from Aleph and sent it to SCS, which analyzed the data over April and May. After a bit of follow-up work, our master library database, or roll-up, was available in Greenglass by early June. So the whole process took 3.5 to 4 months from start to finish. We set up about 30 user accounts in Greenglass, including one for each subject librarian, and everyone ended up using Greenglass differently, some using it extensively and some very little. Right away, without even running any queries or downloading any reports from Greenglass, we could glean useful information about our collection. And by the way, I've indicated that the screen captures on this slide and on my next slide actually show data from our second SCS analysis performed as part of our consortium's group analysis in 2017. Once that new data was available, we had to switch from our library's 2016 data to the 2017 data, so I wasn't able to make a screen capture of the original 2016 data for this presentation. But the collection overview page helped drive home the need for withdrawing more material, especially to those at our library who were reluctant to do so. We could see at a glance that the percentage of our collection that hadn't been used at all over the period that we had circulation data available for was higher than the average percentage for other libraries that SCS had analyzed. While the extent of available circulation data varied from library to library, 52% of our collection had 0 checkouts since 2003 versus an average of 42% for the other libraries over the period for which they had available circulation data. The percentage of our titles which had been checked out more than 3 times was also lower than the average for the other libraries, with our percentage being 18% versus an average of 25% for the other libraries. Overall, our collection was also older than average. Based on publication date, 92% of our collection was more than 10 years old, compared to an average of 88% for the other SCS libraries. We could have determined some of this information about our own collection by requesting reports from class and using our ILS, but without SES, we wouldn't have had the data from the other libraries to compare that information to and just put our need for collection enhancement and weeding in a context, in a wider context. This is a screen capture of the collection visualization feature in Greenglass, which made it easy for us to see how our in-scope collection was distributed across the LC classes. The black bars here show that the largest percentage of our in-scope collection was in the P range, with other large distributions in B, D, H, and Q. This was somewhat expected since the departments with the largest acquisition budgets at my library primarily purchased materials for those LC classes. But it was useful to see that this was the case even after you excluded the materials bought by those departments for collections that were outside the scope of our analysis, like reference, ebooks, and AV materials. We could then use the Query Builder tool to locate items with one or more LC ranges by circulation counts, data publication, holdings by other libraries, and other metrics. Unlike our second analysis with our consortium, we didn't model a retention list under the TU contract in 2016. Instead, we used Greenglass primarily as a tool for librarians to identify titles to withdraw from their subject areas. But as I said before, each librarian ultimately used Greenglass differently. One of my colleagues, our business and economics librarian, combined her use of Greenglass with citation info gleaned from Google Scholar and Scopus. This allowed her to avoid withdrawing titles that were little used or not used at all on our campus and even within our consortium, but which were nevertheless still of ongoing scholarly interest. So over the second half of 2016, as we continued at Towson to work with our data in Greenglass, the consortium's interest in contracting with SES began to pick up steam. There were really two parts to the consortium's contract and implementation. First, the consortium's executive director, working in consultation with the library directors, drafted an agreement for a shared print initiative, which would result from the SES analysis of our combined print collection. The agreement was signed by the library directors over February and March, with 3 of our 17 libraries ultimately deciding to not participate in the shared print program. These were our 2 law libraries and the health sciences library. An implementation team was assembled for the consortium with representation from several of the libraries, or most of the libraries, who were participating in the shared print program and with contacts established at those libraries who weren't able to assign a member to the implementation team. This team, the Shared Print Monograph Collection Task Group, which did not lend itself to a handy acronym of any form, convened in April and worked over the following months defining the scope of our analysis and working with class on the extract of bibliographic item and circulation data. Data became available in Greenglass in early August. So the second part of our consortium's analysis involved the modeling of various retention plans, basically deciding what criteria to apply when deciding which titles we wanted to flag for retention over the duration of our shared print agreement, which was initially set up as a 15-year agreement. Once this was decided, those flagged titles were then assigned by SCS to the participating libraries with an attempt to spread the retention allocations equally. We ended up with each library having 17% of its in-scope collection flagged for retention. My library, which along with Missy's library had one of the larger in-scope collections, ended up with 64,250 titles assigned to us for retention under the chosen model. Each library then had a 30-day period in which to review our retention allocations and make high-level adjustments, looking for things that should have been excluded as out of scope and other obvious changes that we wanted to make to our assigned retentions. My library deleted about 200 titles from our retention list during this 30-day period. Because we had our time-sensitive collection enhancement project already well underway at Towson, we weren't able to suspend weeding activity while the data was extracted from our ILS and then analyzed by SES. A couple of other libraries among the 14 were in a similar position, so class kept track of the items withdrawn by these libraries between the data extract and the initial retention allocation. They then sent this information to SCS so that they could then adjust the retentions accordingly, removing those items. So altogether, both phases of the consortium's implementation of SCS took about a year, from the signing of the shared print agreement by the library directors in February and March 2017 to the assignment of the final adjusted retention allocations at the end of March 2018. So I thought I'd close my part of the presentation by mentioning what's next for my library in the consortium. I've also included images of some of the library spaces that we've repurposed since our weeding project began 2 years ago. The shared print agreement called for the creation of a new work group to establish procedures and policies for the program, serving as a successor to the implementation group. However, the library directors later expressed reservations about creating another consortial work group. They and the consortium's executive director are currently considering whether to instead employ dedicated staff for this purpose, as some of the other shared print programs have done. Meanwhile, policies and procedures still need to be developed, so several of us from the implementation group, including Missy and myself, have volunteered to remain active on these issues for the time being. The collection enhancement work at Towson isn't quite done. We've withdrawn about 40,000 volumes since 2016, so we've got about 5,000 more to go through the rest of this year to meet our 2-year goal of 45,000 withdrawals. But we can't simply withdraw titles the way we did over the first 18 months now that we have assigned retentions that we're responsible for under the shared print agreement. Given the scale of our weeding effort, it's not really possible to add a step to our existing workflow where we first check to see if a title is marked for retention before we weed it. So we've decided to suspend our weeding for the time being to conduct a complete audit of our assigned retention titles. Our Dean and Management Council have decided this will be a high-priority, library-wide project with about 35 staff members at all levels participating. We'll be printing out our entire retention list sorted by LC call number and making it available in a series of binders divided by LC class. The audit process will involve 4 basic steps: locate the book on the shelf, mark the call number label with a red permanent marker, apply a specially made stamp near the item barcode sticker, and then check the item off on the list before moving on to the next item. Any items that are not found on the shelf will be highlighted on the printed shelf list, and then a staff member from my department will then check in the ILS to see if that item is checked out. And then we have further steps after that. We'll also be instructing the staff to pull any items that are significantly damaged so we can then review whether the item can be repaired or replaced. If they can't be repaired or replaced, they'll be removed from the catalog and added to a spreadsheet we're maintaining so that we can report lost, damaged titles among our retention allocations to the other libraries in our shared print agreement. So on this slide, you can see a sample of books that we marked as retention titles. The idea here is that once the audit's completed, librarians who are weeding within their areas of the stacks will be able to see at a glance which titles are marked for retention and therefore avoid pulling them for withdrawal. So we're trying to put that red line at the bottom of the call number label so we're not marking the book up itself, but having it be fairly plainly visible for the librarians. Oops. So this slide shows the stamp that we're applying near the item barcode. This is intended to serve as a backup just in case the librarian fails to see that red mark on the call number label. Staff who withdraw our weeded titles from the catalog have to scan the barcode to call the item up in our ILS, so placing the stamp nearby will let them know that the book should be returned to the stacks and not withdrawn. This collage of images shows some of the ways that we've repurposed library space that was formerly used for stacks in various parts of the library. The image it's an ongoing work in progress, but the image at the top in the center shows one of the small study nooks that we've put in areas where the stacks were removed. This is just an interim configuration, as you can tell by the mismatched carpet and the old study tables. Over time, the carpet and furniture will be replaced, but these spaces have been surprisingly popular with our students, even in their current state. The image down in the lower right corner shows a similar space with a single long table, which has been really popular with groups of students studying together. The image at the bottom shows a small group seating area we placed, this one over here, outside one of our instruction rooms. And then, what else do I have? Oh, the images here and up in the upper right corner show a space that's proven, it's where our recent periodical issues used to be shelved in shelves. And that's proved to be it's got sort of configurable seating arrangements, and it's really popular with the students, especially during midterms and finals for group study. And then the image at the bottom is one of our new instruction rooms on our second floor. This is an area where our microform collections used to be. After we removed ranges of shelving from the second floor stacks, we moved the microforms to that space, freeing up this area for an instruction room. But this was really just to replace an instruction room that we lost on the floor above, which we lost to make space shown on my next slide possible, which is our fairly new 24/7 study space, which is open year-round and accessible to anyone with a current Towson ID card. This was built where our circulation desk and access services department were formerly located. They were moved to the area where our second floor instruction room used to be. So it's kind of, that shows how, you move one thing in the library and there's this cascading effect of things, especially when you don't have an area to sort of store things in the interim, which is the case for my library. So with that, I will hand things over to Missy to share her library's experience with SES. Thanks.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming to our presentation, and we hope you learned something and find it helpful. I'm Missy Latham, the Assistant Director of Collections and Access Services at Loyola Notre Dame Library in Baltimore. We're less than 3 miles away from Rick's Library, and we're about 2 miles away from Johns Hopkins, the major research library in our immediate area, just to give you a location check. The Loyola Notre Dame Library supports the research, teaching, and learning missions of 2 universities, Loyola University, Maryland, founded in 1852, and Notre Dame of Maryland University, founded in 1895. Both are master's large institutions. LNDL was founded in 1968 when the 2 universities agreed to merge their libraries and create a separate nonprofit entity with its own board of directors. The combined library opened its doors in 1973. In 2008, the original building was renovated, and a new addition, seen here, was completed. So you're here to learn something about our experience with OCLC's Sustainable Collection Services. For LNDL, the data provided by Greenglass will be useful for weeding. However, the greater benefit of Greenglass was that we were able to leverage the data to join 2 key consortia in the last 3 years. The consortial relationships have given our users access to over 15 million additional items. I want to start my part of this presentation by summarizing what we've been doing at LNDL the last 5 years. In late 2012, Barbara Priest became LNDL's 4th library director. Since that time, we have evaluated the library's infrastructure, rebuilt where necessary, and realigned our focus in context with the 2 universities that we serve. We have targeted 5 key areas to build a strong foundation. For us, building and space are 2 different things. Because we are a separate institution from the universities that we serve, we retain responsibility for the building's maintenance, utilities, and improvements, with building costs at 12.5% of the entire library budget. In all of these areas, we place an emphasis on users' needs and seek collaboration with faculty and students to co-create and evolve the future of LNDL. Since our 2008 building renovation, we, like many libraries, have seen shifts in usage of technology and collections. Our faculty's efforts to infuse technology with pedagogy and our students' increasingly diverse learning styles have emphasized that we need to evolve library collections, spaces, and services to meet those needs. From 2013 to 2016, LNDL's focus was to build a strong foundation, as shown by the gray pillars. Oops, I'm on the wrong slide. Excuse me, as shown by the gray pillars on this slide. From that base, we have launched a number of initiatives focused on users' needs. The green flags highlight our focus on expanding collections and preserving access through a multi-consortia strategy in which we improved interlibrary loan services and joined 2 consortia. Focusing on the blue flags, we conducted a technology audit in partnership with Loyola. From there, we developed a 3-year technology plan, which the Board of Directors approved. The net gain was a 43% increase in technology investment in year 1 of the plan. The pink and orange flags highlight some specific engagements with our users to reimagine spaces, display student work, and to develop a learning commons in response to Loyola's strategic plan. In the last 18 months, we have nearly completed infrastructure rebuilding and have shifted our energies to working collaboratively with our users and developing key partnerships. We believe our foundation is sufficiently strong to launch future initiatives. So now it's time to drill down a bit. As I mentioned earlier, we address 5 key areas in our library: building, space, technology, campus collaborations, and collections. I'm going to focus on collections for the rest of this presentation. So let's begin the story. I started at LNDL in July 2012 as the head of acquisitions. As I learned about the collections in space, it became evident that I arrived at L&DL in the midst of a cultural shift. Librarians in acquisitions and administration spent their entire careers building L&DL's collections through purchases and gifts. The library's just-in-case collection development model, coupled with very little weeding over the years and no visible stacks maintenance, meant no space for new acquisitions. This is actually a picture of our book stacks as they look today. We needed to develop a new collection model that matched current teaching and research needs, come up with a weeding plan, and communicate across departments to get our stacks in order. Also, librarians in key positions were scheduled to retire, and I needed to do succession planning immediately. I was aware that I didn't have buy-in from the librarians and staff who built the collections over the years. They were not interested in participating in what they saw as dismantling the collection. Here is an example of how I became acutely aware of staff negativity toward weeding and mistrust of my intentions. On the left side of this screen is part of an email from fall 2013 in which I asked for an access report. It took several days and several drafts to get what I wanted. In the end, I learned that 65% of our over 13,000 plus gift books had never circulated in 10 years. We used that data to develop a very restrictive gift policy, but I envisioned hours and hours of staff time just to create additional reports and prepare lists before getting to the actual weeding of the collection. Considering our collection size of about 300,000 items, my perceptions about lack of staff buy-in, and knowledge of upcoming retirements, I began to look for other options to support our goals to refresh the collection. I first saw a demonstration of Greenglass in January 2014 at ALA Midwinter and was impressed with the amount of data provided and the simplicity of working with it. With a locally run report, I could see call number ranges with the greatest numbers of books, but not whether the books were unique or special in some way. With Greenglass, I would be able to see circulation history of an item, the number of libraries that held the same or similar title, and compare our holdings to various groups, such as libraries in the state of Maryland or holdings in HathiTrust. Life got busy, and I didn't think much about weeding again until December 2014, about a month before the retirement of our associate director. He had pretty much single-handedly managed collection weeding for over 40 years. By using SCS, we would in effect be able to outsource our data and in 8 weeks or less get a collection analysis to begin weeding projects. We had pricing in hand for an individual library analysis. I thought SCS data was excellent value for the money, and I went to my director ready to sign a contract. Then Barbara asked me to investigate the cost and possibility of a shared collection analysis with our consortium, the Maryland Interlibrary Consortium, or MIC. I was focused on our local need, but our director saw potential value in learning about our collections as a group. There were 4 MIC libraries in 2015. We shared an ILS, a systems librarian, a few databases, and a weekday courier service for delivery of materials. We weren't particularly close geographically, so staff met only once a year at an annual retreat. The directors met regularly, but other crossover was generally limited to systems needs. A MIC collection analysis would demonstrate repetition and uniqueness within the consortium, so we developed a proposal, and eventually 3 library directors agreed to contract with SCS for a single shared instance of Greenglass. Mixed data was loaded to Greenglass in July 2015. While we had buy-in from the directors, there had been little to no planning among the staff about how to use the data from Greenglass once we received it. No one was ready to talk about a cooperative weeding and/or retention plan for the good of the consortium. In fact, 2 directors were retiring or had just retired, and 1 library had a mandate to drastically weed their collection. I confess that prior to contracting with Greenglass, I had assumed that we would consider the needs of the consortium in items that had never circulated. Instead, each library ended up starting their weeding projects independent of discussion with the others. In many ways, LNDL was an island unto itself. We shared an ILS with other libraries, but we had no real partnerships or shared goals. So in July 2015, we received our MIC data. Then in August 2015, our director learned of a group called EAST, the Eastern Academic Scholars Trust, that was working to create a shared print initiative in which each member library would commit to retain a portion of their print monographs for a minimum 15-year period and make them available for all in the consortium to borrow through interlibrary loan. We saw this shared print plan as a great fit for LNDL. First, we would be considering our local retention and weeding decisions on a larger scale that fit with regional and national trends. Second, we would be able to repurpose some of our stacks spaces to meet current user needs for individual, collaborative, and incubator spaces. Although the first cohort of East libraries had already been finalized, they made an exception for LNDL to join because we had Greenglass data in hand. LNDL joined East in November 2015 and agreed to postpone weeding for about 6 to 8 months while policies were developed, collection data was analyzed, and retention commitments were finalized. In the end, for reasonable annual dues, we were able to provide access to over 6 million items by joining East, and we were partnering with an organization that had shared goals and clear policies and procedures. East has grown since 2015 and now boasts membership of 60 academic and research libraries in 11 states from Maine to Florida and holdings of over 9 million items. The red flags on the map represent the first cohort in which LNDL joined, and the green flags show the second cohort of East libraries. This partnership with East would not have been possible in 2015 if we had not had Greenglass data in hand. Joining East and having assigned retentions gave us flexibility at LNDL to begin re-envisioning our space and services. Nearly simultaneously with joining East, our director and the executive director of the University System of Maryland and Affiliated Institutions, or USMAI for short, were discussing the possibility of bringing LNDL into their 16-member academic library consortium. LNDL would be a test case to determine if the USMAI structure could absorb private academic libraries into the mix. There were a number of pieces to consider in a transition to a different consortium, including migrating from one ILS to another, funding structures, size and quality of collection, etc. Again, it paid off to have current data about our collections available through Greenglass. LNDL joined USMAI in June 2016, and the first order of business was migrating to a new ILS in a short 6 months. All weeding was put on hold while staff focused on this system migration. You'll see from the gray pillars on this slide that we have received 3 instances of Greenglass data, and that East has been a bridge between the other 2 analyses. Rick told you about USMAI's experience of Greenglass, so I won't repeat that story. What I can say is that the Greenglass overlap proved extremely useful to LNDL. When we joined USMAI, we learned that it would be time and cost prohibitive to migrate our acquisitions and circulation data to the USMAI ILS. We were glad to have captured much of our circulation data in Greenglass, at least for the in-scope materials of the East and MIC projects. Looking back, I would say that the greatest benefit of the MIC collection analysis proved to be leveraged to join East. 2 benefits of the East collection analysis are that at least 1 copy of every book in the consortium is committed to retention by at least 1 library. Those retention commitments have freed LNDL to repurpose space to meet changing user needs. The second benefit of East is that our circulation data back to 2003 was retained. When USMAI contracted with SES, we were on a new ILS and had only 6 months of circulation data in that ILS. I have used the East circulation data many, many times over the last 2 years. The USMAI directors elected not to join East in their second cohort, but they did fund an SCS collection analysis. Both Rick and I are serving on a task group to develop policies and procedures around the retention commitments that participating libraries have made. We already have borrowing and lending commitments among the libraries, but the shared print initiative allows us flexibility to withdraw titles locally and still have access to borrow and receive other titles more quickly and with potentially longer lending periods than through interlibrary loan. We have made a couple of detours from our original roadmap to refresh the stacks, but we have refreshed 2 collections to date, reference and art books, both housed on the main floor. We're very excited to have completed these projects because they are integral to transforming the main floor into an information commons. Very quickly, I'll tell you about the differences in the 2 weeding projects and how Greenglass data made one project so much easier than the other. Reference materials were outside the scope of all 3 of our Greenglass collection analyses, so we were forced to weed this collection using librarian and faculty input. Our goal was to reduce 12,000 to 14,000 reference items by at least 60% during the course of 2 semesters. Research and instruction librarians were asked to give the most input since they were working regularly with faculty and students and served at the reference desk. They felt pressure, insecurity, and that they lacked knowledge, but they stuck with the process. Toward the end, we relied on the dust test to make decisions. We met our goal, but the process was slow and painful. In contrast, the art collection refresh worked very well and relied almost entirely on student help. We ran Greenglass reports to get lists of items that had never circulated and were not required for retention. Students pulled the items to weed. Our head of archives and special collections, who was also liaison to art, reviewed 2 carts of books per week to see if there was anything that she wanted to save. Once approved for weeding, the students changed the status in the catalog, processed the books for withdrawal, and loaded them to book bins for our bookseller partner to pick up. By the end of May, all shelves in art are 2/3 full, so there is room to add new materials, and we had little angst over weeding materials that had never circulated. So on the left is that same picture I showed earlier. On the right is a section of the art books, each shelf 2/3 full. So now everything is in its place and ready to be moved to the 2nd floor. This area will be cleared of book stacks and new furniture will be delivered in the next few months. If you plan to use Greenglass as a tool to help you meet your library's needs, I recommend starting with a discrete collection or call number range. We learned a lot about workflows, staffing, and equipment while doing the reference and art weeding projects. So what's next? We are finally ready to begin weeding the stacks. Last fall, students conducted a shelf audit to help us see where the most crowded parts of the collection are. We're going to focus on those call number sections first, broadly the B's, D's, H's, and P's. We are also nearing the end of our 2-year time period to use the East instance of Greenglass, so we are investigating ways to save that circulation data that I mentioned previously. Note that at the bottom of this chart, the BFs are full with no room for growth, according to the chart description. So I have run a report in Greenglass to show the BF call number range with 0 circulations and not required for retention by my library. That gives me almost 2,000 items from which it's relatively safe to start weeding materials. I could also add something like a date if I don't want to weed anything newer than 2010, for example. And then finally, this view of Greenglass lets me see a lot of detail for a specific title. In this particular case, the item is held by nearly 500 U.S. libraries, including multiple libraries in Maryland. And as a reminder, the title has never circulated in my local library. I have confidence that it's okay to weed it. It's been 3.5 years since I first contacted SCS to investigate a collection analysis. I could not have predicted at the time the opportunities that would open up for us, nor the unique ways that Greenglass data has served our purposes. Our director calls this living in the gray, and she encourages us to embrace ambiguity. The internal and external partnerships that we have formed along the way and the collaboration among library staff to meet shared goals has been refreshing and rewarding. Thank you.